What other ethnic group right now has multiple groups trying to define their origin and saying, oh, this, this. Nobody else is doing that. Why is that something that we're doing? Not even African people are doing that. Only Black Americans are trying to figure out still who we are. Only us. That's because something was snatched from you and then something artificial was thrown on it and now you realizing, damn, wait a minute. This shit don't fit. These ain't my clothes, man. They don't fit. Wait, which clothes are mine? Oh, it's the Indians. They go to Hebrew and no, not the African. That shit, they don't want that. You know what I'm saying? So.
Can you explain the diaspora? Just what it means, just the word and the origin.
Diaspora is to spread out. So when we speak of, diaspora is a term that don't just apply to the Black experience. We just using it in reference to the Black experience. So in reference, there's a Jewish diaspora. There's a European diaspora. Diaspora is just the spreading out or the extension of, something or people from its original foundation or its original, place of origin, from its place of origin and then spread out. So the diaspora is just related to all of the different places around the world that African people were sent to in history and became communities or ethnic groups, within their own right, which is directly tied to colonization. Because almost everywhere where we are as a community, a people, as an ethnic group of people or a nationality of people, every nation in modern times is a result of colonization, and therefore differences in, the original people arise based on wherever it is they were sent to or wherever it was that they went to. So that's the diaspora. The diaspora is the international African community in its individual ethnic groups that have arisen through colonization by them being put in different, places that became nations.
Because of colonization and because we have been split up like we have, can you help us to understand, where the people are? As
far as African people?
Yes.
Well, I mean, everywhere. In particular, you just follow the trade lines, because usually you were sent to places where there was a trade development or some type of resource that needed to be developed, and therefore there was a need for slaves or, laborers or whatever. And that's where they were, taking people. So, there's a significant, Black population, we know in North America, in America and throughout the Caribbean and South America, the whole North American continent is, filled with Negroes, but then there's Europe, there's, even in Africa, there's only one place in Africa that wasn't colonized, that didn't have to gain their independence. Every other nation there went through a period where they had to gain their independence to become the nations that we see today, except for Ethiopia. It's the only place that hadn't been colonized in the sense of losing its nationhood. Now, it did have a foreign invasion and it was influenced by foreign ideologies, but its nationhood was never relinquished. You know what I'm saying? And they fought, a lot of wars. 3/4 of the world's population is melanated. So you can go to deep Asia and find Black people, but not African people. Now, at a point in their history, they were. You know what I'm saying? If you go farther enough back, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the development of ethnicity as it exists in modern times and the African people that come directly from the continent in modern times and were spread out. We're not talking about all the other melanated people who already existed. You know what I'm saying? On majority of the world, so it's real clear to make that distinction because we've been taught to think of Black in terms of skin tone. Anywhere we see Black people, them Black people, no, those are melanated people. Melanin, is the life, it's the lifeblood of creation, period. So yeah, a huge portion of the world's population are definitely melanated. That don't mean that they have the same historical direct origin as you do.
I want to dive into identity a little bit because as people are spread, they came from, being colonized, and then they spread amongst the world like that,
Right.
specific to the modern times, like you just said. So, yeah, explain to me how the different identities came about in America.
I mean, there was a period during enslavement where what you were was stripped from you. That's where it starts. So if you don't know who you are, then now you got to try to figure that part out. So where it came from was when it was stripped from you and an alternative identity was put on you. And then when you realize that there's a disconnect with who they're telling you you should be and who you feel inside, then that's an identity crisis. Mm-hmm. You're like, wait a minute, I don't feel like what I'm being told I am. Mm-hmm. So what am I? Who am I? And that's a question Black people had to ask for themselves, because all of that was stripped from you very deliberately. When we say stripped from you, we mean that on one hand, there's a lot that you wasn't told. And on the other hand, there's a lot of lies that you were told. Mm-hmm. So it was about hiding something from you and then also lying to you about what you seen. So the earliest renditions or the earliest narratives about Africa was, it's this dark continent and there's savagery and, Christianity is what saved you. You should be grateful that God had mercy to bring you from there to the land of opportunity. Mm-hmm. And this was literally a narrative, all the way back, and we talked about how the slaves had to go through a process, called the breaking in period. Before they were brought to America, majority of the ships stopped in the Caribbean first. And that's where, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo, and all of those was where majority American, North American slaves went to first. Mm-hmm. The people that, the Africans that they took, that's where they took them to first. And that was a breaking in period. And it had everything to do with conditioning their minds to be slaves, because these were a proud people because they came from a very rich heritage and a very rich culture, oral traditions and dance and all of these different aspects of culture that they had that had been developed in them for thousands of years. This civilization been, and when I say this civilization, we do understand that we may be speaking of different tribal groupings, but it's still a civilization because all of these people started from the same source, and as their individual groupings created communities and, say it's still a civilization. So, our people those Africans that were brought from that continent and took in, to the ports, it was for a breaking in period. Before they were brought to America to become us, African Americans, they were sent there first because they had to be conditioned to be slaves. And how they did that was they made sure that the women understood that your man is now powerless to help you. That the men understood that your woman is now our property. We can do with her what we want. That your family is not something that you can count on as an entity. We take them, pick them apart. So before we even got to this particular landmass that we call the USA, North America, before we even got here, there was something else done to us to ensure that it'll be easier to manage us here. And that was the stealing of that identity. They had to break us down mentally, and then that created a situation where now we're looking for them to define our value. Mm-hmm. And that's what they, that's ultimately what they did. So the identity crisis that we have stems directly from then. Now, there's never been a commercial state-sponsored movement, to change our minds, because it's not about that. It's just about giving you these physical, attributes of citizenship. Mm-hmm. That's what the struggle was, to make you, more acclimated as a citizen. Oh, you're a citizen. That's what we're fighting for. Civil rights. Mm-hmm. And that's where the Malcolm X, Martin Luther King thing came in, because Malcolm no, we're not fighting for civil rights, meaning rights that we are afforded through a state entity. We're fighting for human rights, rights that we are afforded by nature, by design, by God. That's what you're denying us. It's not we're not trying to get into a position in your system. We want you to recognize that we human too. You can't treat us less than human. The civil part, that's secondary. You know what I'm saying? And that's why he kept saying, that's why he felt, and, a lot of people felt that the civil rights movement was manufactured, because in a major way it was, because they wanted to ensure that the fight is not about you changing your mind on what role you need to play in the system, but that you continue to attempt to get into a position in the system, you know. And we know that this is true because during that time, bro, it was pre-civil rights movement was a period of segregation. And during that period was the period in American history when you own the largest percentage of wealth. Because you had to develop your own. And that's where them communities come from. You talk about Greenwood and Tulsa and Rosewood. I was just looking at one of those early, you know, communities in Atlanta where, because it was segregation, we had to develop our own institutions, and they flourished. Black people had no problem with shopping with each other and, you know, coming together. You know, we look at that. The disunity that exists today is recent. We wasn't like that then. You know, that wasn't culture then. You know, it became the culture that they gave us and that we ultimately accepted once that civil rights movement integrated us. And now you become a part of the larger system. Now we can control the input, right? Because now you in here. Now we can control what you know, see and think about yourself. You know, whereas before when you were segregated, you controlled it and it was all positive and constructive towards community. You know, that's where mutual aid societies come from. That was a big thing in Black culture back then. And mutual aid societies was literally, you know, what the term implies, to where we come together and if you need something or whatever, we got each other. You know, there was whole organizations established for that particular reason. Business, you know, and health-wise and every aspect necessary for our survival, we worked on it together because we had to. Because, you know, we were excluded from, then they said, oh no, we got to bring them in, man. They doing too much. You know, they doing too much. You just think Black Wall Street was happening during a depression, bro. The rest of the country is in a depression and you niggas over here, you know what I'm saying? Y'all like really beginning it though, you know, because you're self-sufficient. So the businesses are being supported by the community that supports, you know, the businesses. So, you know, it was a mutual thing, you know, so it was flourishing. So yeah, you know, the identity crisis arose because they took an identity from you, gave you one that would ensure that you would be able to fit into a subservient role within their system. And then once generations became aware, they sought an understanding of who they really were outside of what they had been defined as, you know, and not many of them, well, in today's time, the problem is today, we not looking back at the source. Now, when we first gained this realization in the 60s and 70s, we did look at the source for our identity. We're like, wait, we're not who they said we are. Well, who were we before they gave us this identity? Well, we were African people. What is that history? What is that heritage? What is that legacy, that greatness? We need to rediscover that. And you had a ton of Black scholars and historians who would get education and degrees from their institutions, but only to understand our origins, you know, and only to take control over that body of knowledge that represented our knowledge of self. And that's where the say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. That's where that comes from. The Black Power movement was directly connected to the independence movement in Africa. And Black Power was a universal declaration because they were gaining their independence there too. And our leaders and their leaders, right, they were directly connected. We recognize this is a universal struggle.
What I see today is a lot of different, you know, I guess people looking for the identities in different ways, like the FBA, the Hebrew Israelites, or, you know, can you talk about, let's start with the Hebrew Israelites.
Okay. What about?
Well, I mean, they're you know, they're tracing their roots back to what they believe is the thing.
They're not tracing no roots. Trust me, ain't no roots been traced for the Hebrew Israelites back to Hebrew Israelites because there is no comparison. There's no DNA comparison. There are no existing, you know, Hebrews. And that's even that term, but just going with that term. There are no existing Hebrew Israelites from ancient time DNA to compare to anybody's DNA today to say that they are those people. There is none, not even for the so-called Jews, you know, not even for Israelis.
Okay.
There's no DNA to compare. What they're doing is they will go off a regional. Oh, your DNA can be traced to this region. And this is where ancient Israel was, or where ancient, the Hebrews were in this region, which, mind you, is a whole, mass, a whole land mass. You know what I'm saying? So,
So what are they doing then? I mean, like, what are they tracing it to?
It's the same. It's literally the same. It's the same motivation that creates Black Christians, Black Muslims, or, even cults, and that's like, we have to believe something that helps us, that empowers us. And there's no greater empowerment for people than saying that you are chosen by God. We know that. The Arabs use that to create a world religion. The Europeans use that to create a world religion. The Chinese use that to create a world religion. That idea that you have a direct, not just connection with God, but you have a purpose, that you are meant to be the cream of the crop on this earth. So the Hebrew Israelites, and that, let's just look at that term itself, right? Hebrew is what's called an exonym. And that means that it's something that they were called. It's not what they called themselves. It's a term that was applied to them outside of their own definition of themselves. So after they existed, somebody came and looked, oh, we'll call them Hebrews. That's literally, they didn't call themselves that. That's not the term that they use. So you can't be saying, oh, I'm a Hebrew. What does that mean? The people who were that wouldn't have called themselves that. The original, Hebrews didn't call themselves Hebrews. They called themselves something else. Figure out what that was and then try to attach to that identity versus calling yourself Hebrew, which is an identity created. And then on top of that, Hebrew is, and the only reason why the term Hebrew and Israelite is together is because of a man that's called Yahweh Ben Yahweh in America, a Black man who started a group, and that's what he called them, Hebrew Israelites. That's not a biblical term. That's not a historical term. Those two phrases don't even go together, really. Because there's literally 1,000 years between Hebrews and Israelites. You know what I'm saying? And so even if we say, okay, they come from the same line, let's say they come from the same tree. Well, if Hebrew is the origin, then Israelite is like a leaf, a piece of a leaf even. You know what I'm saying? Like, hold on. You got all of these branches and all of these different leaves, and then this is Israelites right here. You know what I'm saying? From this big dumbass tree. So trying to put them two together, it's an artificial construct, bro. It's not a historical group that actually existed. It didn't exist until Yahweh Ben Yahweh created a sect, a group of individuals, and that's what they were called. Now, keep in mind, there's one thing to say, that whoever the Hebrews was, the people that were called Hebrews, and mind you, the term comes from, it's like a dual origin because it's uncertain. But one is Eber, right, who was an descendant of Shem, and that's a said origin. But then the term itself means one who crosses over, or those who cross over. So it is believed that they were called that because they migrated from one place to another and they crossed over a river in order to get there. Right. So that's, just as far as that. But whoever those people were, 99% chance they were melanated people. But that don't mean that they were the same ethnic group or ethnicity as us, as Africans or as us. And that's the big thing. Again, and we said that, like, you steady looking at melanated people, and everywhere you see melanated people, you automatically think Black. So yeah, right, automatically. So yeah, the people that were called Hebrews, the people that were called Israelites, in history, certainly they were dark skinned. I even believe they were Africans even. I believe that. But what they're talking about is a direct transmission of culture. It didn't happen. There's no, lineage of Hebrew Israelite or Israelite culture, starting from where they begin all the way to black people in America. It just didn't happen, bro. This is just no historical, Now, and that's the whole thing. Their claim is not even historical. It's more spiritual or religious, which on one hand, I don't have an issue with, because I understand the power of that thinking, which we said, you identify yourself with God, that empowers you, and that's definitely something that we need. Nation of Islam did the same thing. What made him so effective, what made the Nation of Islam so effective was Elijah Muhammad was telling them, black man, you are God, and the white man is the devil. Nobody was saying, whoa, that's a whole new train of thought. For people who were told to walk with their head down when they seen white people. You know what I'm saying? Who had been told that they were inferior all this time. And then he come, no, you are God and he is the devil. Psychologically, it has an effect. So it's the same thing with the Hebrew Israelite concept. Now, my issue with that group is that you attempting to define black identity to something that came a long time after your history began. That don't make no sense, bro.
Right. Why wouldn't you go to the root?
Why wouldn't you go to the origin of who you are versus something that came later? But maybe they don't understand that. So, my issue is that you trying to use the Bible to define you. Bro, the Bible is not an ancient book at all. It was literally created in the medieval times. Literally. It's not an ancient book. It's an AD book. It was written in AD times when you got civilization that go thousands of years BC, which is before Christ. AD is after Christ. So you trying to define yourself by something that came thousands of years after you had already been here, after your civilizations had already even reached, the greatest peaks, right? And then, so, that's really my issue with them, man. It's like you trying to use, and I understand you have this affection towards that book, but I think it would benefit you to learn the origins of it, how it was compiled. Each one is a separate book that was written at a different time period, and all of this was later compiled into one book to make it the Bible that you know of today. But a lot of those books were written after the events they describe, and that's the biggest thing. It's not prophecy if I'm looking back on what happened and talking about it. That's not prophecy. Prophecy comes before, not after. No, these books were literally written. This is historical. These books were written after the events they describe. And that's the whole thing. So you're trying to define yourself by this without necessarily understanding its origin. And that's because that's a remnant of that psychology that they created in you, where you feel like, you got to seek God through their terms. So
no, that's interesting too. You talk about identity, and now you talk about the Hebrew Israelites, and it's kind of like, they were trying to attach to something, right? And that's what it kind of like seems to be in America. You know what I mean? Right. Like, whether you FBA or whether you Indian, or my grandfather was, Cherokee Indian or something like that. Can you speak a little bit about that? The FBAs.
The FBA? Well,
what's the origin of the FBA?
So, from my understanding, FBAs is Tariq Nasheed, right?
That's foundational Black Americans.
Right. And and the whole purpose, from my understanding of the FBAs, their whole purpose, that's not the same thing as saying the Indigenous. The Indigenous group is actually separate from the FBA group. The FBA group is the group that's trying to detach themselves from the diaspora and say, we foundational Black Americans are our own ethnic group, that we need to focus on just our existence and our identity, separate from everybody else's. But then they go off into this confrontational thing where they're saying these other diaspora people come over here and benefit from the work that we did in America. And we got a problem with that, because then they look down on us, after they do. That's the FBA position. And there's a fundamental issue with that. Is that you haven't had an isolated struggle at all. We just said that before you were brought here, you were in the Caribbean, so you was Caribbean before you was African American, foundationally. You were a foundational Caribbean, you know what I'm saying, American before you were, here. So that's out the way. And then, on top of that, throughout your struggle, there has always been the influence of the diaspora, whether through individuals or through, collective movements that were occurring throughout the diaspora as they were occurring in America. But even more particular, people within the American struggle, their leaders, and a lot of your change makers or a lot of and they're not even so much as looking at struggle, they're looking at culture and entertainment and all, even that. There's always been an influence of Jamaicans and Haitians and, Dominicans, maybe to a lesser degree, Africans, it's always been, you don't have an isolated culture, you know what I'm saying? And on top of that, you don't even control it. You don't own it. It's not even something that you did yourself. The only reason why black culture is being mimicked around the world is because it was commercialized, because so that they can profit from it and so that they can give them the same impressions of you that they were giving you of you by promoting this, self-destructive culture all around. And now you seeing it everywhere. It's like, oh, we the most influential. Yeah, that ain't influence, man. That's not influence. That's consumer. That's commodity. That's capitalism. You know what I'm saying? Where, we have a product and we finna promote it all across. And it just so happens that this product stems from the condition of a people that are here. But, we finna exploit that. And that's exactly what they did. So, but my issue in particular with FBA, bro, is that we're not fighting local struggle, bro. The doctrine of white supremacy, the power structure behind Western civilization that was established is not just in America. This might not even be the headquarters. It might be the highest concentration of it, but this is literally global. That's how they're able to have the control that they have. So when you realize that your struggle is global, why wouldn't your fight be? It don't make no sense for you to have something against people that are literally fighting the same enemy and struggle that you are. But you got a problem with them because of, and then we looking at most of the disunity between them is coming from individuals online. You don't know who these people is, but you allowing, what they say to affect how you feel about a whole group. So you online arguing with a, Caribbean person, or an African person who's saying, oh, we're better than y'all. And the Africans think they better than us. Who said, John B. Smooth from Instagram or whatever? How is that defining what the people think of? It's just ludicrous. Don't make no sense. Yeah. But, that's where that identity crisis, comes back into play, man. Because it was real important that you didn't see them as being connected with you. Because, that prevents that unity from ever happening. So we broke up the universal identity. Let's look at white Americans. We say white Americans, right? We think in terms of a monolith. And that's real good for white Americans. But white Americans, Germans, Irish, you got Polish, British, English, you got all of these different ethnic groups. They didn't even like each other, bro. They fought for a very long time. It wasn't until that whole white construct was created where they became one. So now in America, you can't tell one from the other, but they're not all the same ethnic group, but they all benefit from the same power structure that emphasizes a universal, a general, supremacy of them based on their color above everyone else. So why is that so hard for you to see the same construct? We have to be who we are because of what we're up against. And that's what we need to understand. Foundational Black Americans, whatever, you need to understand that you need to be united with the diaspora because that's the nature of the fight, bro. That's what you're being targeted for. The police don't pull up to you and say, wait, what kind of black person are you? You from Africa? Where you from? I only want the American Negroes. That's who I'm trying to hit upside the head. No, nigga, like Malcolm said, you catch hell because you black, man. So that's universal. So why would I have an issue with you? We fighting the same thing, especially if that issue is based off of something that I encountered online with, even if it was 1,000 people saying it. You know, even if it was 1,000, you know, people, Jamaicans or Caribbean people saying, oh, we don't like black, that's 1,000 people, man. You know, that's not indicative of a whole. You can't never, and that's something that we don't like ourselves. You know, we like, oh, you can't define us by what you see certain individuals do. Well, you can't do that to them either. You know, you ain't took no consensus and said, all right, it's official. All Africans or 80% of Africans hate black people in America. There ain't no consensus. There ain't no consensus on that. It might actually be the opposite. You know, so my issue, you know, with the FBA is you trying to detach yourself from your cousins, you know, who are literally fighting the same fight that you fight. And then not only that, it's necessary for your empowerment that you unite with them, you know, simply because you don't have possession of any natural resources here. They do. Down there's a need for you to, you know what I'm saying? That's a connection, you know, that's the need for a connection. Because you got, you know, farms and shit, and, you know, Africa and the Caribbeans, and you should be trying to make some connections, bro, to gain some control. But instead of doing that, you over here, oh, it's just us. Nigga, you ain't got nothing. How it's just us?
Yeah. I think he has something, though.
As an individual, right, absolutely. The founder, right, and it's always like that, right? You got all these people riled up behind this belief that you ain't really behind. It's just like Dane Calloway. Now that's where the native, the we are indigenous stuff come from. That come from Dane Calloway. And I was watching one of his videos. I actually watched a couple of them because I wanted to see, you know, it was some debating online, and they're like, oh, Dane Calloway, you know, he got all the receipts. And I'm looking at this stuff that he's promoting as this shit ain't. Well, his so-called receipts are not receipts at all. And it literally, all you got to do is do a minimal research, 10 seconds of research to debunk what you just seen, but it makes sense. You're not even finna try to go do it. You know what I'm saying? He'll show you some, oh, this is this. And then you, oh, this, oh, yeah. Bro, you ain't gonna check that? You ain't gonna go look and see, you know, but it's just like Trump. You know, Trump can say something or do something, and then if somebody go against it, they just haters.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
He got enough following for it.
Right. Enough to do that. And, you know, it's the same thing that he'll do. So even if you go and you see, like, just to give an example, okay, I show you a picture of a black Indian. Oh, this is original black Indian. And then you go and look up that image and see a different color on that image. And like, but wait, it's white over here. Well, they changed it to look like that, to hide this the original, and they made that one look. And who you gonna believe? You gonna believe what you know what I'm saying? What you've accepted now.
Yeah.
So, oh yeah, that's fabricated. Oh, you got that from a white man. White man made that so they can try to, you know.
Yeah. If you can, speak a little bit about the indigenous people.
So you mean like the black people who say we are indigenous to America?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's, to me, that's like, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. It's so ridiculous to me that prior to this generation, there's no previous black scholar who done all of their research, you know, thousands, you know, however much time of research that they did, whatever they presume. They never said that. This is literally a new concept. Now, Hebrew Israelites, okay, that was a little bit earlier, you know, but this whole indigenous thing, that's brand new. Like literally just this generation has started saying that. And I'm gonna keep it real, bro. I'm truly, truly convinced that the core of the black indigenous movement is self-hate, is a sense of self-hate.
It's deep.
Yeah, because it don't make no sense. And I don't want to say it like this. I'm just trying to, you know, I'm not trying to demean anyone, you know, or any culture. But it don't make no sense if you come from royalty to say that you come from peasantry. I'm just trying to give a illustrative example, right? It don't make no sense if you come from a family or an origins of, you know, abundance to deny that and say that you come from, you know, that's counterintuitive. You say you indigenous Americans, you do know the term America is not what this place was originally called by its indigenous people. So why are you using that to define? It don't make no sense. You know, the people who are this are going to use their authentic expressions and terminologies to define themselves, not something that they were told they are. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with the term African. You know, if you can only see yourself in terms of, you know, African, then you're using a definition, a term that is an outside. It's not internal. It's not what, you know, those people ever called themselves. Mm-hmm. It's what somebody else called them. And now you're using that to define. You got to think about that, bro. Mm-hmm. That's literally like somebody, you giving your child a name and they go to school and the teacher in the school is telling them, no, that's not your name. Your real name is this. And then they come out and they come home. I'm saying, no, you ain't. That ain't your name. I didn't give you that name. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what everybody is calling me, and apparently that's what I am. No, so, no, I think, yeah, definitely the people, those so-called indigenous people, they have a real deep self-hate complex because their idea of Africa has been defined for them as being something primitive, you know, something, you know, and of course, we all receive that same perception, you know, growing up, that same narrative. You know, in the society presented us that narrative. And I think that narrative is real deep in their heads. Mm-hmm. So they don't want that. You know, it's like, ooh, I don't want to be but I want to be thought of as supreme. Well, America is the supreme nation of the world. Oh, well, I'm indigenous to here. Mm-hmm. Bro, your cultural expression comparatively, the native, you know, American indigenous cultural expression compared to the African cultural expression, bro, it's like, you know, molehill to a mountain, man. And it's only because the earliest traces of indigenous culture, 2000 BC, and the earliest traces of your authentic culture is like 10,000 BC, you know, and on. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't even really. But just saying civilization-wise, which is what we're speaking of, you know, as far as civilizations, bro, your civilizations can trace thousands of years before this civilization here. And this expression is far more prolific than what's here. And on top of that, their cultural proliferation over here don't depict you anywhere. So how are you indigenous? You think because you see melanated people here that means, oh, we were already here. No, you a whole different person. That ain't yours. In English America, 1619 is when the first Negroes in English America is said to have came, right? 1619 is when they say the first Negroes in history of the Negroes in English America in Jamestown, Virginia, 1619. But that was the English colony. Before that colony, there were French and Spanish colonies that brought Negroes here too before then. And that goes into the 1500s. But, you know, and, you know, throughout that time from the 1500s up until the 1800s, that's 300 years, bro. There were numerous African people who went, you know, through a lot of different scenarios and circumstances and intermix or intermarry with native indigenous tribes and produce Black Indians. So, you know, that's, you know, over a 200-year period, that's a lot of generations in that time. So, yeah, but that don't make you indigenous. You know what I'm saying? Now, if you have that in your history and you identify with that side, then that's you. You say, hey, that's the side I choose to identify as indigenous, and that's the side because it's actually in me, though. It ain't me identifying with it because somebody told me that that's what all Black people really are. And we've been tricked and there was no slave trade and, you know, all this other stuff. And, you know, they don't even have...
Where's the boats?
Right, where's the boats? You know, they just making up stuff now. Now they saying, oh, the First World War was all of the European nations coming over here and waging war against the Black people that were already here and then putting them into captivity or whatever. Like, Negroes is crazy. The Europeans was fighting against each other. They wasn't united to come and attack no one. You serious? No, so, but that comes from not knowing, bro. If you don't know, then you're going to make up something or accept anything, you know, that you're told about.
Yeah, that's trending.
Right. And mainly it's trending among those who haven't done the research themselves. So my advice is somebody who's trying to trace their authentic identity as a black person in America is to look up some of the black historians who already did the research for you, or go do the research yourself. But don't accept, TikTok or YouTube video or somebody saying something. Even if they showing you receipts, go get your own receipts. Receipts can be doctored. And not only that, one of the things I see is that a lot of times they don't show you sources when they showing you the tidbits of information or pictures or images. They don't show you sources because the source is going to reveal the truth about what they're trying to tell you.
Well, that seems to be the theme though, bro. The theme is confusion.
Right.
You know what I mean? And part of that confusion comes from just the height of technology. Can you give us a few solutions? I don't want to talk about the problem without, and I heard you say a few of them already.
I mean, again, the core of our condition, brother, is mental. It's psychological first. That's why the first step has always been reclaiming the knowledge of self. The issue is that individuals don't know how to obtain that. And they get in their ideas from people who don't know either, but there's an identity crisis that is pre-existing, which causes you to seek it. And that's why we got so many different, definitions, you know what I'm saying, or origin stories out here. And you got, black people leaving all type of stuff about their origin because they don't know. But the solution has already been presented because, again, you don't know that this struggle has already been fought and won. The identity crisis has already been addressed and resolved before our generation. Before, our parents' generation even. And there's, a ton of scholarship that exists of identifying scientifically, historically, culturally, your origin. Returning the knowledge of self to you. That's the most important thing because you can't unite if you don't recognize a shared identity, the reason to unite, And so that's always the core is reclaiming, realigning with your identity, reclaiming the knowledge of self. And the knowledge of self is not what you think happened, but what can be validated as having had happened. And that's what our scholarship was real intentful on doing. Brothers like Chancellor Williams, Yusuf Benji Cannon, John Henry Clark, Anthony Broder, George James. You got a ton of different, and these brothers wrote, they didn't make no TikTok video. Well, it wasn't no TikTok then, or it wasn't no YouTube, but I'm saying they wrote volumes of research. They didn't just sit down, let me make up some stuff. No, they did research. They traveled, they studied, they, learned different disciplines, from archaeology to anthropology to social, they learned all these different disciplines. They did research in order to determine who we are as a people. And that transmission of knowledge was never given to the next generation and the next generation and next, in order for it to become known. So now we have a generation who wasn't connected to that and they trying to figure out who they are, not realizing that somebody already did that work for you, and when you realize that, then you will see why it's a need to unite, with people in the diaspora, because you're literally the same people. We can prove that. We can prove that you are the same people as, black people in the diaspora that particularly that come from the African continent as an ethnic group, So, that's definitely the first thing is the knowledge of self. We have to reobtain that knowledge of self and accept it, for what it is, connect to it. And what it's also going to do is going to impart greatness to you, because when you learn about your origins, you will learn that, wait a minute, we are chosen. We are God's chosen people. We the first people he gave civilization to, the first people he taught how to walk, talk, sing, dance, add, subtract. build, grow, create. It started with us. That's chosen. That's you being chosen, you know, and that recognition is what will empower you to become what you are. Mm-hmm. Not a false identity or a made up identity that was given to you or that you know what I'm saying, that was acquired from you trying to figure out what was going on. No, if you study the authentic trace of your history, you're going to run into greatness. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, foundational greatness. You know what I'm saying? You say foundational Black American. What about foundational human? You are a foundational human. You're a foundational Black American. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Is, you know, your identity is way more powerful than that. Mm-hmm. Maybe that'll be the encouragement needed to overcome, you know, oppression and the doctrine of white supremacy. You know, once we accept that, wait a minute, we literally have a role. We have a divine role, a divine positioning even. That's not based on a religious book. It's literally based off of the experience, the cultural, you know, experience and a development that you were able to achieve before anybody else was. Mm-hmm. He gave you the keys to civilization before he gave them to anybody else. Mm-hmm. That means you're chosen. That's before there was a Bible. Before there was a Bible, you already understood the universal system. Mm-hmm. Before there was a Bible, you already understood it. You had already mapped out the stars. You already understood astronomy and astrology and how it's all connected, you know, because they put those terms represent disciplines that they created in order to control the knowledge of that subject. So astrology or astronomy is a term that defines a body of knowledge that was obtained before that term was put on that body of knowledge, on that understanding. Mm-hmm. You know, it's just like biology. Okay, the study of the Bible. Well, naturally, we had already gained that understanding before it was called biology, you know. So returning to that legacy is what's necessary for us to change our state of mind. Mm-hmm. So, and that's the first thing is that. And then from there, which we're not even looking at saying we're trying to get all Black people to do that. You just need to get enough around you that's, you know, you can move with, you know, and then you move into, okay, how do we secure our existence outside of this system? Mm-hmm. And if you identify as being Black, then you know, committed to the empowerment of Black people, you know, and you recognize, you know, that it is together that we will survive. Those who identify with me as well, with that have that same identity, will survive collectively by working together. That's how, you know, civilizations survive. Mm-hmm. But you got to be able to identify with that group to say that this is who I'm with, because identity and survival is not an individual thing. Mm-hmm. Like literally, if we say that your basic instinct is survival, that's also a social condition, because love and, you know, feeling those emotions those are a part of your survival too. Like literally. So, you know, you definitely have to understand your identity in the context of some group, family, tribe, community, you know, some level. Your identity is defined by others around you, and your self-preservation therefore is directly connected to theirs. And when you accept that identity, you accept that collectively we have to work for our self-preservation, because it's, you know, it's what's necessary.